The dplyr package in tidyverse is the closest to using pivot tables, or especially structured query language, or SQL, that you're going to find in R. I had learned SQL previously, and so dplyr really resonated with me and made it much easier for me to really get going with R. So I wanted to go through a few of the basics of dplyr. So we have a bunch of data sets here that we imported using in the importing video, so I'll keep using them. I'm going to just pull up one called County Pop. I'm just going to have it display here. You can see that it has Minnesota's 87 counties and their 2016 population. So it's a very simple data set, just a couple of pieces of information. With dplyr, there are several verbs that we will use. I'll just list them all here. Select is one, filter is another, group by, oops, go back, arrange, and we're going to, and then later we'll use one called mutate, but for now we're just going to go through these basic ones. So this looks a lot like SQL if you're familiar with the exception being filter is the equivalent of where, and arrange is the equivalent of order or order by. And you, unlike SQL, you don't necessarily have to do them in the same order, but the order that you pick will be will determine what happens, because it happens in order. So if you select certain fields, then you can only filter by the fields that are selected, because the other fields are not there anymore. Same thing with group by. If you can't do a filter on something that's not in your group by if you do your filter after your group by. So sometimes you have to, your order of operations are going to be very important. Let's just look at a really simple example. So the way things work is you put the table name first, or the tibble or data frame. So in this case I have County Pop, and then you put in the pipe. That's a % greater than %. There's some keyboard shortcuts on a Windows machine. It's Control-Shift-M. Mac, I believe it's Command-Shift-M. It's on my cheat sheet here at the top of this web page. And that's your pipe, and you're always going to pipe between each operation. You can keep typing on the same line, or if you think your code is going to get long, you would hit enter and it will automatically indent. So let's say we want to, in this case, let's say we want to filter to only the counties that have a population greater than I'll say greater than 50,000. If I do this, just this, I'm going to run this, it's going to knock it down to 19 rows. Now we could continue piping, and we can say select, and we can say let's just show me the geography. And so then it's only going to show me that column, which doesn't do us a lot of good. So we can, in this case, that's the only column, so you don't really need select. But you could do arrange and say descending by that pop estimate 2016. And now it'll put it in descending order by that column. If you don't do descending, if you don't put the DESC in there, it'll automatically be ascending with the smallest on top. Let's move on to a little harder data set. I'm going to look at this one called deaths. So this is people who have died from opioid-related overdoses in Minnesota over a number of years. So we could look at, we can use our pipe, and we can say select the first name, the last name, the death date, gender, and race, for example. And it's still giving us all the rows, but it's only giving us the columns that we have specified and in the order that we've specified. So for example, we could We can rearrange the order. It doesn't have to go in the order that the data is stored. You can rearrange it to however you like. We can also then filter it. And so in this case, the filter could go either before the select or after the select, depending on what we're going to filter by. So let's say we want to filter by only people who live in Hennepin County. Well, Hennepin County is not one of the things in our select line, so we'd have to put the filter up here. Res county equals Hennepin. Now notice that I did equals equals. So when you want something to be exactly equal to something, you have to do two equal signs. Up here we did greater than 50,000. The other thing you can do is the greater than equal sign to include the counties that are exactly at 50, if there's any that are exactly at 50,000. So here, let's put our pipe back on here. So we're saying use the data frame deaths, filter to only those who live in Hennepin County, lived in Hennepin County, and then show me these columns. So now we've got a smaller row of set of data than we had before. You can also, we could filter our set again. You could do a second filter if you want. We could say gender equals male. See, it got much smaller. It dropped pretty much in half. Or we could have also included that up here, and instead of down here. So you see we've got some flexibility in what we can do. We still get the same 787 rows. Let's talk a little bit about the filtering. So we saw the greater than equal sign. You can also do less than equal, of course, for numbers. We have the equal Hennepin. Let's talk about Boolean logic. So in this case, we're saying, give me all the people who lived in Hennepin and who were men. That's what the comma does. If you want to do an or situation, so let's say we want to do, last name equals Johnson, or last name equals Grossman. I'll just pick something out there. So do you see here that it's got a pipe in between? That this is one way to do it. Let's run this and see what happens. Ooh, there's lots of Johnsons, common name in Minnesota. Another way to do it is to say last name so you put a percent sign in the word in, followed by a percent sign, and then you do C, and we're going to list the possible values in here. So we could say Johnson, Grossman, we'll try Webster, and it's going to find any values where any of those three show up in last name. So it's another way of doing an or. So if you have a lot of values, that is a shorter way to do it than what I showed you the first time. All right. So keep in mind, if you do something like, let's filter to race equals white, and then if you did or gender equals M, what's going to happen is that we're going to get either white people or male. Really, we're going to get any male that is of any race and any white person that is of any gender. So you may not want to do that. You have to think carefully about what you want with the ands and the ors. The other thing is, notice that in our data that is proper case. So if we put it in as uppercase, it'll find nothing. So you need to look carefully at your data. There is a way to, we can do something like, if you're uncertain, one of the things you can do is convert this, use this to upper, and it will automatically find all of them. so to upper around whatever your word is, and then just put everything in capital letters, and it will default to whatever. It'll find everything regardless of the case. So we've looked at the select, the filter, and the arrange. We haven't looked at group by yet. I just remembered, I forgot one of the verbs. It's one called summarize. And you can either type it as summarize with a Z or summarize with an S, the way the British do. And forgive me if sometimes you'll see me typing it either way. So summarize is really the equivalent of the values box in a pivot table. Well, group by is the equivalent of the rows box. Summarize is also the part where you do your counting or your summing or your averaging or whatever kind of thing you want to do. So for example, you could do this on your whole data set and not actually do groups. So for example, we could theoretically here, this is not something you would really need to do very often, but you could say summarize, and then in the summarize verb, what you do is you make a name of a column. So I'm going to call this num deaths, and then the way you tell it to count records is n open parentheses close parentheses, and I'm going to put a space there just so you can see it better. This is just going to return a count of records, and it's going to tell us how many records are in this data set. And if you look over here at deaths, it says we have 3,807 observations. So this should come back as 3,807. It's simply counting the records in the whole data set. The other thing we can do other math in here. Let's say if you had a dollar value field in your data set, you could add up all the dollars here. The only column we have with we could do that with home sales. We'll come back around to that. But we could do something like the average age in the data set. So we can say mean, and then there's a column called age years, which remember is set as an integer. So you can use the mean function to calculate an average. So the average age is 41, which is kind of frightening. You'd think it would be higher than that. But you can do that. Let's flip over to the home sales data. Home sales, it's here. The home sales table is there. I had a typo in there. I had an extra S when I tried to type it. All right, so this is showing us the total homes that were sold in each city each year. So we could, for example, add up all the sales. Let's say we want all the Minneapolis and St. Paul sales. So we could say filter place is either Minneapolis or St. Paul, and then we could say summarize. You see I did that, I did it with the S. Summarize, we'll call this total sales equals sum year 2019. And so what that's going to do is add up all the values in the year 2019 column. So it's, and in this case it's going to add these two values, 49.79 and 33.20, because we told it just do Minneapolis and St. Paul. So if we do that, it's going to give us 8,299. If we wanted to do the whole data set, of course, then you get rid of that filter. So I'm going to make a copy. And by the way, copying and pasting and then editing your code is perfectly acceptable. It's a great idea. It's giving me NA. Why is it giving me NA? Here's why. Let's look at the table. If you scroll down in the table, there are cells that are null, NA. And so it will not sum properly on a column that has null values in it. So there's some directions on my site for how to fix those, and you would need to do that before you run this kind of query. So most of the time you're going to use summarize in connection with a group by. So that would be more like a pivot table in Excel, where maybe you want to count up. Let's take this gender column from the deaths data and say how many men died and how many women died. And so in that case, we're making groups by the gender. So we're going to put in the name of the table and then the pipe, and then we're going to say group by gender, pipe, and then you're going to use the summarize, and you're going to say, I'm going to call it num deaths. That's a name that I'm making a column, so I'm naming my column. Num deaths equals, and then that count, n open parentheses, close parentheses, because I'm just simply counting the number of records. And it's going to give me the total. Now, if you just did group by without that summarize on there, you're going to get all your data back. It's just going to be not work. So I'll put that back. So you got to have the summarize with the group by. And your summarize could have, in this case, it's counting records. Like we did up here, it's summing values in a column. It could be calculating an average. There is a separate package that allow you to do a median. You'd have to have that package loaded. The other thing you can do is you can do more than one thing. So if you did have a so like up in here, let's do this. So we could also we don't have another way to do it. Well, if we did a count, what's going to happen here? This home sales, you're going to get two because it's two records. There's one record for Minneapolis and one record for St. Paul. But this gives you an idea that you could be counting records and be summing a column and get two new columns in your answer if you wanted to. You can do as many as you need. It just depends on what you have. In this case, I can't do much else because I've already grouped by the gender and then there's no other information there to do the work on. Now, one of the things I love about R is that it's a little more flexible than some things. So, for example, there's another verb called mutate that allows you to do things like this. So we can say, let's calculate a percentage. And we can say, take that number of deaths that we just calculated, divide it by the total of num deaths, like add up that whole column and make that the denominator and give me num deaths here. Now it's going to give it to you in a decimal point, but still, yay. If you want it to appear as a percentage, I'd highly recommend the library called Formatable. Loaded that, and then I can say, I can wrap this in percent, and now I have it in a percent. So mutate is just lovely. This is happening on the fly. This is not adding a column to our table. It's just providing an answer. And all of these things that we've done so far here are just in the ether. We're not making any new tables with this because we're not assigning it to anything. We're just having it display the answer. Okay, so let's put a few of these things together. So we could we can say let's use, well, I'm going to need the S on deaths, otherwise it's not going to work. And let's say we want to filter just to the men, and then we could say group by the race, and then we could count up how many people we're talking about. Sometimes I just do count equals n, and I just call it count, even though it's not very specific. You know, good code would maybe have something like num deaths, but by using something like count, it makes it very reusable. You can easily copy and paste this to some other thing and make it reusable very quickly. So this is going to give us a list of the races and the number of men in each race, and it's only men because we filtered to men. And then we can say arrange by that descending count. And of course it's going to be white at the top, but African American, a lot of African American men in here. So this is the number of men by race who died of opioid related deaths during the time period in our data set. And this would be very much like a pivot table where you're using kind of all your tools at your disposal, except for the column. We're not doing a cross tabulation. The other thing you can do is that you can have multiple things in your group by. So we can say group by race, and what else do we have in here? Let's look at our table. We could say race and this, whether or not they were in the armed forces. That's an easy one. And so this is going to count. It's going to say there's this many white men who were not in the military and this many white men who were in the military. And it's counting them over and over. If we were to put the mutate on here as a percent and say count divided by sum count, it's going to give you a percentage of everything. So this is saying that white men who were not in the military make up 87% of the deaths, and white men who were in the military make up 13% of all the deaths, regardless of race, regardless of military service. So that should be enough to get you going. You go through the tutorial called Tidyverse Part 1. And it will walk you through a whole exercise using this deaths data and introduce you to a few more little bits and pieces of Tidyverse and dplyr that you will need for some deeper analysis. Good luck.